Carmilla. Author. Sheridan FANU. We lived in Styria, in a castle. It wasn't that our fortune was princely, but in that remote corner of the world, a small annual income was enough for us to live like big shots. By contrast, in our own country, with the same resources, we would have only had a comfortable life. My father is English, and I, naturally, have an English last name, but I have never set foot in England. My father served in the Austrian army. When he reached retirement age, he was able to use his modest savings to acquire that small feudal estate, which was surrounded by several acres of land. I don't think there is anything more picturesque and solitary. The castle is located on a gentle hill and overlooks an extensive forest. A narrow, unused road passes in front of our drawbridge, which I've never seen raised. In the moat, swans swim among the white blooms of the water lilies. Dominating this entire scene is the wide front of the castle, with its many windows, its towers, and its Gothic chapel. In front of the castle stretches the picturesque forest. To the right, the road runs along a Gothic bridge stretched over a stream that winds its way through the woods. I mentioned that it's a very solitary place. You can judge for yourselves if I'm telling the truth. Looking from the entrance gate toward the road, the forest that surrounds our castle extends 15 miles to the right and 12 miles to the left. The nearest inhabited town is in that latter direction, approximately 7 miles away. The nearest castle of any historical note is that of General Spieldorf, about 20 miles to the right. I said the nearest inhabited town because to the west, only 3 miles away, toward General Spieldorf's castle, there is a small ruined village with its equally ruined Gothic church. There lie the tombs, almost hidden among stones and foliage, of the proud Karnstein family, which died out a long time ago. The Karnstein family once owned the desolate castle that, from the depths of the forest, overlooks the silent ruins of the village. There is a legend that explains why this strange and melancholic place was abandoned by its inhabitants. But I'll talk about that later. The number of people living in our castle was tiny. Excluding the servants and those living in the outbuildings, it was just my father, the most charming man in the world, but quite old, and me, who, at the time of the events I'm about to recount, was only 19 years old. My father and I were the whole family. My mother, from a noble Styrian family, died when I was still a child. However, I had an excellent nanny, Mrs. Sheridan, from Bern. She was the third person at our simple dinner table. The fourth was Miss Lafontaine, a true lady in every sense of the word, who served as my governess to finish my education. Some girl friends of mine would visit the castle occasionally, and sometimes I would return the visit. These were our usual social interactions. Of course, we also received unexpected visits from neighbors. By neighbors, I mean people who lived within a radius of 4 or 5 leagues, about 10 to 12 miles. I can assure you that, overall, it was a very isolated life. The first event that made a terrible impression on me and that is still burned into my memory, is also one of the first episodes of my life that I can recall. The nursery, as we called it, even though it was only for me, was in a huge room on the top floor of the castle, and it had a slanted ceiling with chestnut wood moldings. I must have been about 6 years old when one night, waking up suddenly, I looked around and didn't see the maid on duty. I thought I was alone. It's not that I was afraid, as I was one of those fortunate children who were deliberately spared ghost stories and fairy tales, which make children terrified by a creaking door or the dancing shadow cast on the nearby wall by the uncertain light of an expiring candle. If I started crying, it was surely because I felt abandoned, but, to my great surprise, I saw a beautiful face next to my bed gazing at me with a serious expression. It was a young woman who was kneeling and had her hands under my blanket. I watched her with a kind of pleasant astonishment, and I stopped whimpering. The young woman stroked me, lay down in the bed next to me, and hugged me, smiling. Suddenly, I felt calm and content, and I fell back asleep. All at once, I woke up with the chilling sensation that 2 needles were piercing my chest deeply and simultaneously. I let out a scream. The young woman leapt backward, falling to the floor, and it seemed to me that she hid under the bed. For the first time, I felt afraid and started screaming as loud as I could. The nurse, the maid, and the housekeeper rushed in, but when I told them what had happened, they burst out laughing while trying to reassure me. Although I was only a child, I remember their pale faces and their poorly concealed distress. I saw them search under the bed, in every corner of the room, in the closet, and I heard my housekeeper whisper to the nurse, "Look, someone was lying in the bed next to the girl. It's still warm." I remember the maid caressing me and the 3 women examining my chest, at the spot where I told them I had felt the prick. They assured me that no mark could be seen. I spent the next day in a continuous state of terror. I couldn't be left alone for a moment, not even in broad daylight. I remember my father beside my bed, speaking to me in a jovial tone, and asking the nurse questions and laughing at her answers. Then he would make faces, hug me, and assure me that it had all been an unimportant dream. But I wasn't at ease, because I knew that the visit from that strange creature had not been a dream. I have forgotten all my memories before this event, and many subsequent ones, but the scene I just described appears vividly in my mind, like the images of a phantasmagoria emerging from the darkness. One particularly peaceful summer afternoon, my father asked me to accompany him for a walk in the wonderful forest that stretches in front of the castle. General Spieldorf is not coming to visit us, as we expected, he told me during the walk. Our neighbor was supposed to spend several weeks at the castle. His young niece and ward, Miss Reinfeldt, was supposed to come with him. I didn't know Miss Reinfeldt, but she had been described to me as a charming young woman. I was very disappointed by the news my father had just given me, much more than someone who usually lives in the city could imagine. That visit, and the new friendship that was sure to result from it, had been the daily object of my thoughts for many weeks. When will she come? I asked. Next autumn. In a couple of months, my father replied, and added, I'm glad, dear, that you didn't get to know Miss Reinfeldt. Why? I inquired, both annoyed and curious. Because the poor girl has died. I was profoundly shocked. General Spieldorf had said in his last letter, 6 or 7 weeks earlier, that his niece wasn't feeling very well, but nothing suggested the possibility, even remote, of a serious danger. Here is the general's letter, my father continued, handing it to me. It seems he is very distraught. Undoubtedly, he was very agitated when he wrote the letter. We sat on a stone bench next to the linden tree path. The sun was disappearing with all its melancholy splendor behind the tree-covered horizon, and the stream that ran next to our mansion reflected the scarlet color of the increasingly pale sky. General Spieldorf's letter was so unusual and passionate that I read it again carefully to understand its meaning. Perhaps grief had unhinged his mind. It read, I have lost my dear niece. I loved her like a daughter. I have lost her, and only now do I know everything. She has died in the peace of innocence and in the faith of a blessed future. The monster who betrayed our blind hospitality has been the culprit of everything. I believed I was receiving innocence, joy, and a dear companion for my Bertha into my home. Good God, how foolish I have been. I will dedicate the rest of my days to the hunt and destruction of the monster. I am only guided by a faint light. I curse my blindness and my obstinacy, everything. It is too late. At this moment, I cannot write or speak calmly. I am too upset. As soon as I am better, I will dedicate myself to the search and will possibly go to Vienna. In a couple of months, around autumn, I will visit you, if I am still alive. At that time, I will tell you what I don't have the strength to write now. Goodbye. Pray for me, dear friends. The letter ended there. Although I hadn't known Bertha Reinfeldt, my eyes filled with tears. The news of her death moved me deeply. I handed the general's letter back to my father. The sun was sinking further and further into the twilight, and the evening was sweet and clear. Strolling under the warm light of the sunset, we amused ourselves speculating about the possible meaning of the incoherent and violent statements in that letter. At the drawbridge, we found Miss Lafontaine and Mrs. Sheridan, who had gone out to admire the magnificent moonlight. The meadow across which we had walked stretched out in front of us. To the left, the path ran under some ancient trees and disappeared into the thick part of the forest. To the right, the road crossed a bridge that was both somber and picturesque, next to which a ruined tower stood. In the background of the meadow, a light fog outlined the horizon with a transparent veil, and every now and then, the water of the stream could be seen glistening in the moonlight. Mrs. Sheridan was rather plump and saw everything from a romantic point of view. Miss Lafontaine claimed to be a psychologist and somewhat mystical. That evening, she asserted that the intense brightness of the moon was directly related to a special spiritual activity. The effects of a full moon like that one could be multiple. It influenced dreams, madness, nervous people, and even physical events. Tonight, she said, the moon is full of magnetic influences. Look how the windows gleam with a silvery glow, as if invisible hands had lit up the rooms to receive spectral guests. At that moment, the unusual sound of carriage wheels and the gallop of many horses on the road drew our attention. It seemed to be approaching, descending from the hill that dominated the old bridge. Very soon, a small group emerged from that point. First, 2 horsemen crossed the bridge, then a carriage pulled by 4 draft horses appeared, and finally, 2 more horsemen who were closing the procession. It looked like the coach of a person of high rank. Our attention was fixed on that uncommon sight, which soon became even more interesting, because, just as they had passed the curve of the bridge, one of the carriage horses bolted and, spreading its panic to the others, pulled the whole team away at a frenzied gallop, crashing among the horsemen who were ahead of the carriage and advancing toward us with the violence and fury of a hurricane. At that critical moment, the scene took on the character of a tragedy, due to the women's screams coming from inside the vehicle. My father remained silent while we cried out in terror. The end came quickly. The junction point of the road with the drawbridge was marked on one side by a magnificent linden tree and on the other by a stone cross. The horses, moving at a breakneck speed, swerved in fright when they saw the cross, dragging the wheels against the protruding roots of the tree. Scared by what might happen, I covered my face with my hands, unable to bear the idea of seeing the carriage fly off the road. At that very instant, I heard the scream of my companions, who were a little further ahead than I was. I opened my eyes, driven by curiosity, and looked upon a very confused scene. 2 horses were lying on the ground. The carriage was overturned, resting on one side, with 2 wheels in the air. The men were busily working to fix the vehicle, from inside which an authoritative-looking lady had emerged, nervously wringing a handkerchief in her hands. We helped a young woman, apparently fainted, out of the carriage. My father had approached the older lady, hat in hand, offering help and shelter in the castle. The lady didn't seem to hear anything, and only had eyes for the fragile girl who had been laid back against a bench. I approached. The young woman had lost consciousness, but she was undoubtedly alive. My father, who prided himself on having some medical knowledge, took her pulse and assured the lady, who had introduced herself as the girl's mother, that the pulse, though weak and irregular, was detectable. The lady clasped her hands and raised her eyes to the sky, apparently in a momentary transport of gratitude. Then, suddenly, she expressed her feelings by making theatrical gestures, which, however, are spontaneous in certain types of people. She was an attractive woman who must have been seductive in her youth. Thin, though not skinny, she was dressed in black velvet. Her pale face maintained a proud and authoritative expression, despite the agitation of the moment. "What bad luck I have!" she exclaimed, wringing her hands. "I am on a journey that is a matter of life or death. An hour's delay can have irreparable consequences. It is not possible for my daughter to recover from the blow she received and continue a journey whose duration cannot be foreseen. I must definitely leave her behind on the way. I don't want to run the risk of arriving late. How far away is the nearest town? It is necessary that I take her there, to pick her up upon my return. And to think that I will have to spend at least 3 months without seeing my dear daughter, without having any news of her." I tugged on my father's jacket and whispered in his ear, "Father, tell her to leave her with us. I would really like that. Do it for me. If the lady wishes to entrust her daughter to the care of mine and our housekeeper, Mrs. Sheridan, if she allows her daughter to stay with us, under my responsibility, until her return, we will consider it a great honor and will give her the care and devotion that the duty of hospitality requires," my father said solemnly. "I cannot accept," replied the stranger, with great caution. "It would be taking advantage of your kindness too much. On the contrary, you would be doing us a great favor. In fact, it would fill an unexpected void. Just today, my daughter suffered a great disappointment due to the news that a visit we were expecting has been cancelled. If you leave your daughter in our care, it will be her best consolation." There was something so special and imposing in the look and manner of that lady, and in a certain sense fascinating, that, even disregarding the entourage that accompanied her, she gave the impression of being a person of rank. Meanwhile, the carriage had been righted and the horses, now calmed, were hitched up again. The lady gave her daughter a look that did not seem affectionate to me, as might be expected after the terrible scene, and then she called my father with a gesture, and they stepped a few paces away from us. While she spoke, the lady maintained a cold and serious expression, very little consistent with her previous behavior. They conversed for a few minutes. Then, the lady returned and took a few steps toward her daughter, who was resting in Mrs. Sheridan's arms. She knelt beside her and whispered something in her ear. She kissed her hurriedly and then rushed into the carriage, closing the door, while the postilions climbed onto the driver's seat and the outriders spurred their horses. The postilions cracked their whips and the horses broke into a gallop. The carriage disappeared in a cloud of dust, followed by the 2 horsemen who closed the procession. We followed their progress with our eyes until they definitively vanished into the mist, and the creaking of their wheels and the clatter of the horses' hooves galloping faded away. To prove that we had not been victims of a hallucination, the girl remained among us, and she was precisely at that moment regaining consciousness. I couldn't see her, because her face was turned toward the side opposite where I was, but I heard her voice, very sweet, asking in a pleading tone, "Where is my mother? Where am I? I don't see the carriage." Mrs. Sheridan answered her questions as best she could, and gradually, the young woman began to remember what had happened. When she found out that no one had suffered any injury, she felt very relieved. But when we told her that her mother had left her in our care and that she would take about 3 months to return for her, she burst into tears. I was about to go over to her to help Mrs. Sheridan in her efforts to console her, but Miss Lafontaine stopped me, saying, "Don't go near her, miss. In the state she is in, she wouldn't be able to handle more than 1 person at a time." I figured I could visit her once they had settled her in her room. Meanwhile, my father had sent for the doctor, who lived about 2 leagues, roughly 6 miles, away, and he ordered a room to be prepared to accommodate the girl. The stranger stood up and, leaning on Mrs. Sheridan's arm, slowly crossed the drawbridge and entered our garden. The maid immediately accompanied her to the room that had been assigned to her. "Do you like our guest?" I asked Mrs. Sheridan. "Tell me what impression she made on you." "I like her very much," she answered. "I think she is the prettiest girl I have ever seen in my life. She is approximately your age and she is truly lovely." "Didn't you notice that there was another person in the carriage?" Miss Lafontaine intervened. "A woman who didn't even show her head." "No, we hadn't seen her." Miss Lafontaine described a strange person to us, dressed in black, with a red turban on her head, who continually looked through the small window, making gestures and contemptuous faces toward the 2 women. She had bulging eyes and her protruding teeth looked like those of a harpy. "Did you notice the unpleasant appearance of the servants?" Mrs. Sheridan asked in turn. "Yes," my father agreed, "they looked like thugs. I've never seen men like them. I hope they don't rob the lady when they cross the forest. But they must be very skilled rascals. They fixed everything in a moment." "Perhaps they were tired from the long journey," Mrs. Sheridan said. "Besides their untrustworthy appearance, their faces were drawn and they seemed to be furious. I must confess that they have piqued my curiosity, but I trust that the girl will explain everything to us tomorrow, when she is feeling better." "I don't think she will," my father said with an ambiguous smile, as if he knew more than he was saying. This fueled my curiosity to know what the lady dressed in black had told my father during the brief conversation they had. As soon as I was alone with him, I tried to coax it out of him. My father was not hard to convince. "There's no reason for me to hide it from you. The lady told me she was afraid to leave her daughter with us because she is a girl with delicate health and has bad nerves, though she doesn't suffer from seizures or hallucinations." "Doesn't it seem odd to you that she told you this?" "She didn't need to clarify that point." "Anyway, that's what she told me," my father interrupted. "She explained to me that she is undertaking a long journey of vital importance to her. She is obliged to travel with the greatest possible speed and discretion. In 3 months, she will come to pick up her daughter. Meanwhile, she must not say anything about her identity and where she is going." When she pronounced the word discretion, she emphasized it with a pause, looking me in the eyes with a certain sternness. "I think it's important. Did you see how quickly she left? I hope I haven't made a mistake by taking charge of this girl." Although the doctor didn't arrive until 1 in the morning, I couldn't go to bed. When the doctor returned to the parlor, his report was very optimistic. The patient had gotten up and her pulse was regular. She had no injury and the nervous trauma had left no trace. Nothing prevented me from visiting her if she consented. Consequently, I sent her a message via the maid, asking if I could make a brief visit. The maid returned immediately, saying that the young woman would be very happy with my visit. I didn't lose a single moment. We had lodged our guest in one of the most beautiful rooms of the castle. The young woman was reclining, in the light of the candelabra, at the head of the bed. Her graceful figure was enveloped in a silk robe embroidered with flowers and trimmed with a satin ribbon, which her mother had tossed at her feet when she was still on the floor. But, as soon as I approached the bed to greet her, something made me fall silent and step back a few paces. I will try to explain myself. The face I saw before me was the same one that had appeared to me during that terrible night of my childhood, the face that had impressed me so much and whose appearance I had thought about for years, secretly horrified. It was a lovely face, and its expression retained the melancholy sweetness it had when I first saw it. Suddenly, it lit up with a smile, as if the young woman had also just recognized an old friend. A silence fell that lasted a few moments. Finally, the young woman spoke. "I could not." "How strange," she exclaimed. "Some years ago, I saw your face in a dream, and since then it has obsessed me so much that I haven't been able to forget it." "It is curious," I said, trying to get over the horror that had prevented me from uttering a word until that moment. "I also saw you some years ago, 12, exactly, I don't know if in a dream or in reality. And I haven't been able to forget your face since then either." Her smile became sweeter, and the look of curiosity I had noticed in the young woman at first disappeared. I felt more confident, and I carried out my duties as a hostess, welcoming her to our home and expressing the satisfaction that her unexpected arrival had brought to everyone in the house, and especially to me. As I spoke, I took her hand. I was somewhat shy, which is understandable given the solitude in which I lived, but that special situation made me eloquent, almost bold. The young woman suddenly squeezed my hand and held it between hers, looking at me with her bright eyes. Blushing, she smiled again and returned my greeting. Although I hadn't fully recovered from my first impression, I sat down beside her and the young woman told me. "First of all, I need to tell you how and where I first saw you. It is truly remarkable that we dreamed of each other exactly as we are now, even though the dream took place when we were children. I was no more than 6 years old. I suddenly awoke from an agitated dream and seemed to find myself in a room very different from my nursery, a chamber whose walls were covered with dark wood and which appeared full of beds, chairs, and other furniture. I remember the beds were empty and there was no one else in the room but me. I looked at the room with great curiosity, admiring, among other things, a large 2-armed iron candelabra that I would recognize among 1,000 if I saw it again. Then I climbed onto one of the beds to reach the window, but at that very instant, I heard a crying sound coming from one of the beds. That's when I saw you. You were exactly as I see you now, a beautiful girl, with golden hair and enormous blue eyes. Your lips were the same, too. The way you looked at me charmed me immediately. I jumped onto the bed and hugged you. I think we fell asleep for a while. A scream woke me up. You had woken up and were shrieking. I got scared and fell to the floor, where I lost consciousness. When I woke up I was back home, in my own room. I have never been able to forget your face. It's not possible that all that was just a simple dream. Truly, the girl I saw is you." I then recounted my vision, which aroused in my new friend an admiration that did not seem feigned. "I don't know which of us was more frightened," she said, smiling. "If you hadn't been so charming, I think I would have been more scared. Don't you think the best thing to do is to think that we met 12 years ago and that, therefore, we are lifelong friends? I, at least, believe that since our childhood we were destined to be so. And on my part, I have never had a true friend. Will I find one now?" She sighed and looked at me intensely with her beautiful black eyes. The truth was, that young woman attracted me in an inexplicable way, but at the same time she inspired an indefinable repulsion. However, despite the contradiction in my feelings, the attraction was what won out. That young woman, still a stranger, to some extent, interested and captivated me. She was so lovely and fascinating. I remember noticing a certain tiredness in her and I hurried to wish her good night. I added, "It might be better if a maid sleeps in here with you tonight. A servant is waiting for me outside in the hall. She's very serious and won't bother you." "That's very kind of you," the young woman replied, "but I can't sleep if there's someone else in my room. I don't need help, and I want to confess a small quirk of mine. I'm terrified of thieves. Once, they raided my house and killed 2 servants. Since then, I'm used to locking the door. You'll have to excuse me, but I can't help it." She held me tight for a while, then she whispered in my ear. "Good night, darling. It's hard for me to leave you, but it's time to rest. Until tomorrow. We won't be apart for long." She sank onto the pillow, sighing, while her beautiful eyes looked at me with a loving and melancholic expression. She sighed again. "Good night, my friend. Young people fall in love and get attached instantly." I was flattered by the obvious affection the young woman showed me, although it seemed I had done nothing to deserve it. I loved the confidence she had shown me from the very beginning. It seemed obvious we were destined to be best friends. The next day arrived, and we saw each other again. Her company made me happy for many reasons. In the light of day, she hadn't lost her charm. She was, without a doubt, the most beautiful creature I had ever seen, and the unpleasant memory I held of her appearance during my childhood dream had transformed into a pleasant sensation. The young woman confessed that she, too, had been startled upon recognizing me, and felt the same sense of repulsion mixed with her attraction to me. We both laughed at our astonishment. I mentioned that there were many things about her that fascinated me, but also others that I disliked. I'll start by describing her physically. She was of average height, slender, and had very harmonious features. Aside from her languid movements, truly very languid, nothing about her appearance suggested she was sick. She had a rosy and luminous complexion, and her features were small and perfect. Her eyes were black and bright, her hair truly spectacular. I have never seen hair as long and silky as hers when she let it down over her shoulders. I often buried my hand in her hair and giggled foolishly at the incredible weight of it. Her hair was soft and vibrant, dark brown with golden highlights. I liked to feel it in my hand and then let it go while my friend, sitting in an armchair, talked non-stop. I liked to twist it, braid it, play with it. Good God, if only I had known everything. I mentioned that some of her characteristics didn't sit right with me. I said that the trust she had given me from the start had won me over. Nevertheless, everything relating to herself, her mother, or any aspect of her private or family life, brought about a strange reticence in the young woman. Of course, it wasn't reasonable for me to press on those matters, and perhaps I wasn't behaving well. My duty was to respect the serious order given to my father by the lady dressed in black. But curiosity is a feeling without scruples, and no girl willingly puts up with disappointment regarding what interests her. What harm could there be in my friend telling me what I so ardently wished to know? Did she not trust my sense of honor? Why wouldn't she believe me when I assured her I would never divulge a single word of what she told me? Her persistent refusal, always accompanied by a smile, seemed like an attitude completely out of sync with her age. I can't say the situation led to arguments between us, because it was impossible to get angry at the young woman. Perhaps my insistence was inappropriate, even rude, but I felt genuinely driven by curiosity. Her explanations didn't clarify anything for me, or at least that's what I thought. They can be summarized in 3 vague revelations. The first was her name, Carmilla. The second, that her family members were nobles or intellectuals. And the third, that her home was located to the west of ours. She didn't tell me her last name, her titles of nobility, the name of her properties, or even the region where she lived. It's not that I constantly harassed her with my questions. I simply limited myself to posing them whenever the opportunity was right. I preferred indirect questions. Once or twice, in reality, I attacked her head-on. But whatever tactic I used, the result was always the same, a complete failure. Complaints and caresses were useless, though I must confess she knew how to evade questions with evident skill, and she seemed genuinely upset that she couldn't satisfy my curiosity. Whenever one of these situations arose, she would throw her arms around my neck, press me against her chest, and rest her cheek against mine, whispering in my ear, "My darling, I know your heart is hurting. Don't judge me as cruel. I'm just obeying an inevitable law that constitutes my strength and my weakness. If your heart is hurting, mine bleeds with yours. In the midst of my great sadness, I live off your vibrant life, and you will die sweetly for mine. It is inevitable. And just as I draw near to you, you, in turn, will draw near to others and learn the ecstasy of cruelty, which is a form of love. Don't try to know anything more about me or my life, but trust me with all your love." And after speaking in a soft, low voice, she would squeeze me in her arms, and her lips, kissing me tenderly, would make my cheeks burn. That excitement and that language were incomprehensible to me. I tried to avoid her embraces, which weren't too frequent, but I lacked the energy. Her words echoed in my ears like a lullaby and overcame my resistance, plunging me into a kind of daze, from which I only awoke when I freed myself from her arms. I didn't like those incomprehensible effusions. I experienced a strange and confusing sensation that, while agreeable in a certain sense, simultaneously flooded me with fear and repulsion. Whenever one of these scenes took place, I felt extremely agitated, and as the pleasure it produced increased, so did my disgust. I know what I've just explained may seem paradoxical, but I can't express what I felt any other way. 10 years have passed since those events took place, and my hand still trembles as I write about the situation I was unconsciously involved in. Sometimes, after a long period of indifference, my strange and beautiful friend would suddenly take my hand, squeezing it with passion. She would blush and look at me with eyes that were alternately languid or fiery. Her behavior was so similar to that of a lover that it caused me intense uneasiness. I wanted to avoid her, and yet at the same time I let her dominate me. Carmilla would take me in her arms, look intensely into my eyes, her ardent lips tracing my cheeks with 1,000 kisses and, with a barely audible whisper, she would say, "You will be mine, you must be mine. You and I must be one thing, and forever." Then she would lean back against the armchair, covering her eyes with her hands, and I felt profoundly disturbed. "What do you mean by your words?" I tried to find out. "Do I remind you of someone you loved very much? I don't like you talking to me that way. When you do, you don't seem like yourself. And I don't recognize myself either when you look and talk to me like this." I couldn't find a satisfactory explanation for those displays of affection. Yet, they didn't seem feigned or false. Undoubtedly, it was a spontaneous outburst of a repressed instinct or feeling. Was Carmilla having hallucinations? Was she crazy, despite what her mother claimed before leaving? Or was it simply a romantic trick? On more than one occasion I had read the story of a young man who entered his beloved's house dressed as a woman with the help of an adventuress. Could this be the case? The hypothesis flattered my vanity, but it had no basis whatsoever. For long periods of time, I meant absolutely nothing to Carmilla, who merely gave me an occasional ardent glance, that's true. And apart from those fleeting moments of excitement, her mannerisms were completely feminine. Her habits, on the other hand, were quite strange. Generally, she got up very late, never before noon. Then she would only have a cup of very hot chocolate. After that, we would walk together for a short while. As she soon felt exhausted, we would return to the castle or sit on a bench under the trees. The most curious thing was that her physical weakness was never accompanied by mental exhaustion. Her conversation was always brilliant and lively. Occasionally, she would make some vague allusion to her home, her childhood, or some memory of her life, and through her words, it was easy to guess that her habits and customs were very different from ours. From these occasional allusions, I came to deduce that her native country was much farther away than I had initially thought. One afternoon, while we were sitting under the trees, a funeral procession passed by us. It was the burial of a very pretty girl whom I knew because she was the forester's daughter. The poor man was walking behind the coffin containing the remains of his dear and only daughter and seemed heartbroken. He was followed by some villagers, singing a funeral hymn. When the procession passed in front of us, I stood up as a sign of respect, and joined my voice to theirs. My friend yanked brusquely on my dress and I turned around, surprised. In an irritated tone, she said, "Don't you realize how out of tune their voices are?" "Well, I think it's a very sweet song," I replied, annoyed by that untimely interruption, and because I was afraid the mourners would notice our argument. The singing continued. "They're tearing up my eardrums," Carmilla exclaimed furiously, covering her ears with her hands. "I hate burials and funerals. So many useless things. Because you have to die, everyone has to die, and everyone is much happier after death. Let's go back home. My father has also gone to the cemetery. Did you know?" "No, I don't care. I don't even know who the dead person is," she replied as her eyes gleamed. "It's the girl who thought she saw a ghost about 2 weeks ago. Since then, she's been getting worse, and she passed away yesterday morning. Don't talk to me about ghosts. I wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. I hope we don't have an epidemic around here. There are some symptoms," I continued. "The pastor's wife died a week ago, and she also said she felt a strange pressure on her neck, as if someone was trying to choke her. My father says these hallucinations are common in cases of epidemic fevers. The woman was perfectly fine the day before, but after that night she unexpectedly weakened and died a week later. Well, I suppose they've finished with the funeral songs by now. Our ears won't be tortured again. All these things make me nervous. Sit next to me, closer. Take my hand. Squeeze it hard, harder." We had moved back a few steps and Carmilla sat on a bench. Her face had changed so much that I was frightened. She had turned pale. Her teeth were grinding and she was pressing her lips together, shaken by a continuous shudder. All her energy seemed focused on fighting that attack. Finally, she uttered a muffled cry and slowly calmed down, the fit of hysteria overcome. "This is what happens when people are overwhelmed with funeral hymns," she said. "Don't let go of me, I feel much better now." Perhaps to dispel the deep impression that seeing her in that crisis had made on me, she was very animated and talkative as we walked back to the house. That passed like a summer cloud. But I still had the chance to witness a new explosion of Carmilla's anger. One day, we were looking out at the landscape from one of the large drawing room windows, when we saw a tramp crossing the drawbridge, heading toward the castle courtyard. I knew him perfectly well. He came to the castle every 6 months. He was a hunchback, and his face had the biting expression often seen in men who are victims of a physical deformity. He wore a dark, pointed goatee, and when he smiled he opened his mouth from ear to ear, showing very white teeth. He was dressed in a buffalo hide jacket, adorned with numerous ribbons and bells. From his back hung a lantern and 2 boxes whose contents were already known to me. In one of them he kept a salamander, and in the other a mandrake. He also carried a violin, a box of amulets against the evil eye, and several cases of diverse content. He leaned on a black wooden cane with a copper tip. He was accompanied by a skeletal dog that faithfully followed him everywhere. But the animal stopped in the middle of the drawbridge, bristled its hair, and began to howl sadly, refusing to move forward. Meanwhile, the tramp had reached the center of the courtyard and, removing his ridiculous hat, bowed in a comical reverence. Then he grabbed the violin and began to play a cheerful tune, accompanying it with a song so off-key and dance steps so comical that I burst out laughing despite how much the sinister howling of the dog had impressed me. "Would the young ladies like to buy an amulet against the vampire, which I hear is prowling around here like a wolf?" the tramp said, dropping his hat to the ground. "People are dying everywhere, but I have a talisman that doesn't fail. You just have to sew it into your pillow, and when the vampire shows up you can laugh in its face." The amulets consisted of strips of transparent paper, with Kabbalistic figures and drawings. Suddenly, Carmilla bought a talisman and I imitated her. The tramp observed us and we were smiling, amused, at least I was. But, suddenly, as he looked at us, the tramp's eyes, sharp blue eyes, seemed to discover something that drew his attention for a moment. He immediately pulled out a leather case filled with all kinds of small steel instruments. "Look, miss," he told me, showing me the case. "Besides some less useful activities, I practice dentistry. Will you shut up for once, little animal? If you don't stop howling, the young lady won't hear what I'm telling her. As I was saying, I'm a dentist, and your friend has the sharpest teeth I've ever seen. Long, sharp, pointed like a spear, like a pin. Yes, I saw them perfectly. They are dangerous teeth. I know about these things, and here I am with my file, my probe, and my forceps. I'll make them rounded and pretty. If the young lady agrees, instead of fish teeth she'll have a set of teeth worthy of her beauty." Is the young lady mad? Have I been too bold? Did I offend her? Carmilla, in fact, looked at him with an expression of hatred. She moved away from the window, reproaching me. "And you allow that charlatan to insult me that way? Where is your father? I want to ask him to throw him out of the castle." My father would have ordered him to be beaten up, and then burned alive. However, as soon as the man who had insulted her was no longer in sight, her anger disappeared as quickly as it had arisen. After a few moments, she had already forgotten the hunchback and his extravagant words. That same afternoon, my father arrived very agitated. He told us that another case similar to the previous ones I've spoken about had appeared. The sister of a tenant on our estate, who lived a mile away from our castle, had suddenly fallen ill. She said she had been attacked by a monstrous being, and her condition was worsening, slowly but relentlessly. Ultimately, my father said, all this can be attributed to natural causes. These poor souls are susceptible to incredible stories, and thus trigger their hallucinations. "It's certainly a terrible thing," Carmilla observed. Of course, my father agreed. "It scares me to think I could be the victim of a similar hallucination. Even if it were only a hallucination, it must be as horrible as if it were a real event." "We are in God's hands," my father continued. "Nothing can happen without his consent, and everything will end well for those who love him. He is our creator. He made us and he will take care of us." "I believe," Carmilla replied, "that all things happen by the imperative of nature. And that the illness spreading through the region is also a matter of nature. Don't you think?" "The doctor is coming today," my father said, avoiding answering the young woman's question. "I'd like to know what the doctor thinks of this phenomenon, and what he advises us." "Doctors have never done anything for me," Carmilla replied. "Have you been sick?" I asked her. "Sicker than you have ever been." "A long time ago?" "Yes, a long time. I've forgotten everything except the pain and the weakness." "Then you must have been very young." "I think so. But let's not talk about this anymore. Don't try to make your friend suffer." She looked at me languidly and, taking me by the waist, led me out of the room. Why does your father enjoy scaring me so much? She asked me, once we were outside, trembling slightly. Don't believe that, dear, that's not his intention. And you, are you scared? I would be if I thought that we were also in the same danger as those poor people. Are you afraid of the idea of death? Of course, everyone is afraid of that idea. Do you believe, for example, that it is terrifying to die while you are loving? Two lovers who die together, and this way they can live together forever. Girls are nothing more than caterpillars and only transform into butterflies when summer arrives. Meanwhile, they are chrysalises and larvae, each with their own particular forms and inclinations. A certain Mr. Buffon tells it that way. The doctor came that night and shut himself up with my father in his study, where they remained for a long time. He was a very experienced physician, about 60 years old. His clean-shaven face appeared as smooth as the surface of a pumpkin. As they left the study, I heard my father say, laughing, "I'm surprised to hear such words from a man as sensible as you. What then, do you think of hippogriffs and dragons?" The doctor also laughed, shaking his head. In any case, life and death have always been a mystery, and we know very little about what might happen. They walked away chatting and I couldn't hear anything else. At that moment I didn't know what theories the doctor had ventured, but now I think I understand them. One afternoon, the son of the picture restorer arrived from Graz, transporting 2 large boxes full of paintings in his cart. His arrival was a real event. The boxes were left in the hall. The staff took care of the young man and accompanied him to the kitchen to give him dinner. He then joined us in the main hall, where we had gathered beforehand to open the boxes. Carmilla was sitting, looking distractedly at the old paintings, almost all of them portraits, which had been sent away for restoration. My mother belonged to an old Hungarian family, and most of the paintings came from the maternal branch. My father was reading the titles of the paintings from a list, and the craftsman was taking them out of the boxes. I don't know what their value might have been, although they were old and some were very curious. I was seeing them for the first time in my life, as moisture and dust had hidden the canvases for a long time. "I've never seen this painting before," my father commented, pointing to the canvas the restorer held in his hand. "Here, in one corner, is the name, which I managed to decipher before sending it to the restorer. Marcia Karstein. It has the date 1768. It will be interesting to see what has emerged now." I remembered that painting. It was a small, unframed, square canvas, so darkened by time that we were never able to truly see that Marcia Karstein, if it was indeed her portrait. The restorer displayed the canvas with evident pride. It was a young woman with a most beautiful face, and I was astonished by the liveliness of her expression. But what astonished me most was her extraordinary resemblance to Carmilla. "Do you realize, darling?" I asked her. "This is a real miracle. It's you, alive and smiling. All she needs is to speak. Isn't that amazing? Look, Papa. She also has a small mole on her throat." My father smiled and said, "It really is an extraordinary resemblance." But, to my surprise, he didn't pay any more attention to the fact and continued his work with the restorer. For my part, I felt my admiration grow as I gazed at the portrait. "Can I hang it in my room, Papa?" I asked my father. "Of course, dear," he said. "I'm glad you like it. It must be more beautiful than I thought if it resembles your friend so much." Carmilla did not seem to have heard the compliment. She was reclining in an armchair and was staring intently at me with her beautiful eyes, her mouth slightly open and smiling as if in ecstasy. "Now the name can be read clearly," I said. "It's not Marcia. It seems to be written in gold letters. The name is Mircea, Countess of Karstein. Above the name there is a small crown, and below it an inscription, Anno Domini 1698. I descend from the Karsteins." "Ah," Carmilla exclaimed languidly. "I also believe I am a distant descendant of that family. Are any of its members still alive?" "I don't think there's anyone left with the last name. The family died out during the Civil War, a very long time ago. The ruins of the castle are only a few kilometers from here." "Very interesting," Carmilla murmured distractedly. "But look how beautiful the moonlight is tonight." She looked through the half-open door. "What if we went for a walk?" "Tonight reminds me of the night you arrived," I said. Carmilla sighed, managing a smile. She stood up, and we walked out onto the courtyard, arms around each other's waists. We strolled slowly and silently to the drawbridge. Before our eyes lay a beautiful plain, bathed in moonlight. "So you still remember the day I came?" Carmilla whispered in my ear. "Are you happy to have me here?" "I'm very happy, dear Carmilla," I replied. "And you asked them to let you hang that portrait in your room," my friend murmured, with a sigh. Then she squeezed me tighter with the arm around my waist and rested her head on my shoulder. "You're so romantic, Carmilla," I exclaimed. "When you tell me the story of your life, I'm sure it will be like reading a love novel." She kissed me silently. "I'm convinced, Carmilla, that you've been in love," I continued. "And I'd venture to say you're still preoccupied with some love affair." "I've never been in love, and I never will be," Carmilla asserted. "Unless I fall in love with you." In the moonlight, she looked more beautiful than ever. After giving me a strange, timid look, she hid her face in my neck, in my hair, breathing rapidly. She seemed about to burst into sobs and was squeezing my hand, trembling. Her soft cheek was burning against mine. She murmured, "My darling, I live in you, and you will die in me. I love you so much." I pulled away from her. Carmilla was looking at me now with eyes from which the fire and life had vanished. And as if waking from a dream, she added, "Let's go back. Let's go home. I think you're unwell, Carmilla. You should have a small glass of wine," I told her. "Yes, I think so. I feel much better now. In a few minutes I'll be completely fine." "Yes, I will have a glass of wine," and, approaching the door, she added, "Let me look for a moment. Perhaps it's the last time I see the moon with you." "Are you really feeling better, Carmilla?" I asked. For a moment, I feared she had caught that strange epidemic plaguing the region. "Father would be very upset if he knew you were unwell and didn't say anything. Our doctor is a very smart man. You are all excessively kind to me. But what I have is not a case for doctors. I'm not sick, just a little weak. The slightest effort exhausts me. But I recover very easily. See? I'm already fine." She seemed to be. We kept chatting for a while, and Carmilla was very animated. The rest of that evening passed without any recurrence of what I called her asterisk exaltation. Carmilla's ardent glances, her absurd way of expressing herself, sometimes scared me, I confess. I accompanied Carmilla to her room, as usual, and stayed chatting with her while she got ready for bed. "I think a day will come," I said, "when you will have complete trust in me." She turned, smiling, but didn't answer. "You don't answer," I said, "because you can't give me a satisfactory answer, can you?" "I shouldn't have brought it up." "You have every right to," Carmilla replied. "I love you dearly, and I consider you worthy of all my confidences, believe me. But I am bound by a promise, more bound than a nun to her vows, and I cannot speak about myself, not even with you. But the moment is approaching when you will know everything. You will judge me cruel and selfish, very selfish, but remember that asterisk love is always like that. The more intense the passion, the more selfish it becomes. You cannot imagine how jealous I am of you. You must come with me, you must love me until death. Or perhaps you will hate me, it doesn't matter. But come with me and hate me through death and beyond. The word indifference does not exist in my vocabulary." "You're talking nonsense again," I objected. "I am extravagant, silly, and capricious. But calm down. From now on I will speak reasonably. Have you ever danced?" "No. It must be lovely, right? I've almost forgotten. It's been so many years." I burst out laughing. "You're not that old. You can't have forgotten your first dance yet. Only by making a great effort can I remember it. I see everything through something that intervenes between the memory and me, like a dense, yet transparent curtain. That night I was like dead in my bed. They wounded me here," she touched her chest, "and I've never been the same since." "Were you close to dying?" "Yes. A cruel, capricious love had invaded my life. Love demands sacrifices, and in sacrifices, blood runs. Now let me drift off to sleep. I am very tired. How will I manage to get up and lock the door?" I bid her good night and left the room feeling uneasy. The night terrors. The delusions of nervous people are contagious, and they are almost always imitated by those of a similar temperament. I, too, had adopted Carmilla's habits. I locked my bedroom door, influenced by her fantastic fear of hypothetical night assailants, murderers, or thieves. Also, like Carmilla, I meticulously inspected my room every night before going to bed, to ensure no one was hiding in it. After taking all those cautious steps, I lay down and fell asleep almost immediately. I kept a light on in my room. It was an old habit, and no one had been able to convince me of its uselessness. Only then could I rest peacefully. But dreams penetrate stone walls, illuminate empty rooms and darken lit ones, and the characters involved in the dream enter and leave at will, mocking all locks. That night I had a dream that was the beginning of a strange anguish. I wouldn't call it an obsession, because I was certain I was asleep, that I was in my room, lying in my bed. I saw, or thought I saw, the room with its usual furniture, but darker. At the foot of my bed, something slippery moved, which I couldn't clearly distinguish. Suddenly, I realized it was a large, black animal, covered in soot. It looked like a monstrous cat. It was about 5 feet long, and I deduced this because when it paced at the foot of the bed, it spanned its entire width. It paced like a caged beast. I was so terrified that I didn't even have the strength to scream. The animal's steps grew faster and faster, and the room darkened by the moment. I felt something climb onto my bed. Enormous eyes came close to mine, and suddenly I felt a piercing pain in my chest, as if 2 pins had been driven into me. I woke up with a scream. The room was illuminated by the light I left on every night, and at the foot of my bed stood a female figure dressed in black with her hair cascading over her shoulders. She was motionless as a statue. There was no sound, not even her breathing. I looked at her, and the figure seemed to move. It slid to the door, which was open, and disappeared. Immediately, I felt as if a great weight had been lifted, and I could move and breathe. My first thought was that Carmilla had tried to play a trick on me and that I had forgotten to lock the door. But I got up and found it locked from the inside, as always. The idea of opening it terrified me. I went back to bed and hid my head under the sheets, more dead than alive. The next day, I didn't want to be alone for a moment. I should have told my father everything, but I didn't for 2 opposing reasons. First, because I feared he would mock my story, and his mockery hurt, and second, because I feared he would believe that I, too, was a victim of that mysterious illness spreading through the region. My father had a weak heart, and I didn't want to frighten him. But I told everything to Madame Perrodon and Mademoiselle Lafontaine. Both realized I was in a state of abnormal excitement. Mademoiselle Lafontaine laughed, but I saw Madame Perrodon look at me with concern. "By the way," said Mademoiselle Lafontaine, laughing, "on the linden path, behind Mademoiselle Carmilla's room, there are ghosts." "Nonsense," exclaimed Madame Perrodon, who must have found that association of ideas untimely. "Who told you that story, dear?" "Martin says he went twice to repair the old balustrade before dawn, and he always saw the same female figure walking along the linden path." "Don't tell Carmilla anything," I pleaded. "Her window faces the path, and she's even more impressionable than I am." That day, Carmilla got up later than usual. "I was very scared last night," she said. "I'm sure I saw something horrible. Thank goodness I had the amulet I bought from the poor hunchback. And to think I treated him so badly. I dreamed that a black thing approached my bed, and I woke up terrified. For a few seconds, I actually saw a black figure next to the fireplace, but I touched the amulet I keep under my pillow, and the figure disappeared. I'm convinced that if it had gotten closer, I would have ended up with my throat slit like those poor women. Well, listen to what I'm going to tell you." I told her about my nighttime adventure. She seemed frightened. "And did you have the amulet with you?" she asked me. "No. I put it in a porcelain vase in the drawing room, but tonight I'll take it to bed, since you believe so much in its effectiveness." After all this time, I can't understand how I managed to overcome my terror and sleep alone in my room that night. I remember perfectly placing the amulet under my pillow and falling asleep almost immediately, into a much deeper sleep than the previous night. The mysterious disappearance and the doctor's visit. The following night was also quiet. I slept soundly and without dreams, but I woke up tired and melancholic, although I can't say it was an unpleasant sensation. "I also had a wonderful night," Carmilla told me in the morning. "I've sewn the amulet into my nightgown. The night before, it was too far away. I'm sure it's all pure imagination. I thought dreams were generated within us by the spirit of evil, but the doctor told me that's not true. It's a fever or an illness knocking at the door, and since it can't enter, it leaves that warning sign." "And why do you believe in the effectiveness of the amulet?" "I suppose it's soaked in some drug that serves as an antidote against malaria." "But does it only act on the body?" "Of course. Do you think malevolent spirits would be scared of colored ribbons or a little cheap perfume?" "No, certainly not. These evils float in the air, first attacking the nerves and then infecting the brain, but before they can settle permanently, the antidote kicks in and destroys them. I'm convinced that was the amulet's effect. It's not magic, but a natural remedy. For a few more nights, I slept perfectly. But every morning I felt the same tiredness, and all day I was dominated by the same sensation of languor. I seemed to have changed. A strange melancholy took hold of me. The idea of death made its way into my mind. The state I was in was sad, but also sweet. And no matter what it was, my soul accepted it. I didn't want to admit I was sick, or tell my father, or call the doctor. During those days, Carmilla lavished her attention on me much more than before, and her moments of exaltation were also more frequent. Without realizing it, the illness had taken hold of me, the strangest illness that has ever affected a mortal being. I grew increasingly accustomed to the feeling of powerlessness that invaded my entire being. The first transformation I discovered in myself was almost pleasant, something like the curve that initiates the descent into hell. While I slept, I experienced a vague and curious sensation. It was usually a sudden, pleasant, icy shiver like the one you feel when you bathe in a river and swim against the current. A series of seemingly endless dreams followed the shiver, but they were so confused that I could never remember, afterward, the setting, the characters, or their actions. They left me with a feeling of terror and exhaustion, as if I had just made a great mental effort or run a grave danger. The only memories I retained of all those dreams were the sensation of having been in a dark place, of having talked to people I couldn't see, and the echo of a female voice so deep that it seemed to speak to me from far away. A voice that always intimidated and subjugated me. Sometimes I felt the brush of a hand caressing my cheeks, other times, the pressure of burning lips kissing me, more passionately as the kisses descended towards my throat. There, I felt the final kiss. My heart beat faster, my breathing became more labored. Then I experienced a sensation of choking and, in the middle of a terrible convulsion I lost consciousness. These terrible events now happened to me 3 times a week and left a deep mark on me. I was pale, the purple circle around my eyes was increasingly visible, and my languor grew day by day. My father frequently asked me if I was unwell, but with an obstinacy that now seems inexplicable, I assured him over and over that I was perfectly fine. In a sense, it was true. I felt no pain and could not complain of any physical discomfort. My ailment seemed imaginary to me, and however painful my sufferings were, I lovingly and secretly cultivated them. Carmilla complained of dreams and feverish sensations similar to mine, although less alarming. If I had been capable of understanding my situation, I would have begged for help and advice on my knees. But the narcotic of an unsuspected influence was at work in me, and my senses were dulled. I will now speak of a dream that led to a strange discovery. One night, instead of the solitary voice I heard in the void, I heard another voice, sweeter and tenderer, and at the same time more terrible, saying, "Your mother warns you to beware of the murderer." At the same instant a light unexpectedly appeared, and I saw Carmilla standing near my bed, clad in her white nightgown, completely stained with blood. I woke up with a start, convinced that Carmilla had been murdered. I jumped out of bed, screaming for help. Madame Sheridan and Mademoiselle Lafontaine rushed out of their rooms, extremely alarmed, and lit a lamp on the landing of the stairs. I told them what had happened and insisted on seeing Carmilla. We went to her bedroom and called her through the door. She didn't answer, despite our cries, and the fact alarmed us all, as the door was locked from the inside. We returned to my room and furiously shook the bell at the head of my bed. If my father had slept on our floor, we would have called him immediately, but he slept downstairs, out of earshot, and getting to his room required organizing an expedition for which none of us felt strong enough. The servants came running. Meanwhile, we had put on our robes and slippers. We went back to Carmilla's room, and, after calling her again repeatedly, I ordered the servants to force the door open. Once it was open, we entered the bedroom. Everything was in order, just as I had seen it when I bid Carmilla good night. But my friend had disappeared. Seeing that the only sign of disorder in the room was that caused by our intrusion, we calmed down a bit and soon regained our senses and dismissed the servants. Mademoiselle Lafontaine ventured the opinion that Carmilla, suddenly awakened by the door being forced, had been frightened and had hidden under the bed or inside the closet. It was natural that she wouldn't come out while the butler and servants were in the room. We called her again, but she didn't answer. That increased our perplexity and anxiety. We examined the windows, but they were closed. I begged Carmilla, if she was hiding, not to prolong the joke any longer and end our anxiety by coming out of her hiding place. But it was all in vain. It was evident that she was not in the bedroom, nor in the dressing room. I was extremely intrigued. Perhaps Carmilla had discovered a secret passage. The old guard said one existed in the castle, but no one remembered exactly where. The mystery would undoubtedly be cleared up, but for the moment we were perplexed. It was 4 in the morning, and I preferred to spend the rest of the night in Madame Perrodon's room. But daylight did not bring the solution to the riddle. Carmilla had disappeared. My father was desperate, thinking about what would happen when the girl's mother returned. I was also desperate, but my despair had other causes. The morning passed amid the greatest alarm and agitation. There was even talk of dragging the river. Noon arrived, and the situation had not changed. Around 1 o'clock, it occurred to me to take another look at Carmilla's room. I got there, and my astonishment was boundless. Carmilla was in her room, looking at herself in the mirror. I couldn't believe my eyes. My friend signaled to me. Fear was written on her face. I ran to her, hugged and kissed her repeatedly, and then rushed to the bell and shook it desperately for everyone to come and be reassured. "Dear Carmilla," I exclaimed, "what happened to you? Where have you been?" "It was a prodigious night," she replied. After closing the bedroom door, as usual, I went to bed. I slept without interruption or dreams, but upon waking, I found myself on the dressing room sofa, with its door open and the bedroom door forced. How is it that I didn't wake up? There must have been a great commotion, and I'm a very light sleeper. How is it possible that I found myself out of bed without knowing anything? Meanwhile, my father, Madame Perrodon, Mademoiselle Lafontaine, and several servants had arrived. Naturally, Carmilla was besieged with questions, but her answer was always the same. My father paced the room, apparently lost in deep thought. I saw Carmilla follow him with her gaze, and there was a worried expression in her eyes. Finally, my father dismissed the servants, approached my friend and, taking her delicately by the hand, led her to the sofa, where they sat down. "Do you mind if I ask you a question, dear?" my father inquired. "Of course. You have every right to ask what you want, as long as it doesn't cross the boundaries set by my mother." "Well, dear, we won't talk about what your mother forbade, but about what happened tonight. You got out of bed and left the room without waking up. And all this with doors and windows locked from the inside. I have a theory, but first I want to ask you a question." We all held our breath. "The question is this. Are you a sleepwalker?" "No, not now. But I was in my childhood." "I see. And, at that time, did you often get out of bed in your sleep?" "Yes. At least, that's what my nanny told me." My father smiled, nodding. "What happened has a simple explanation. Carmilla is a sleepwalker. She opens the door and, contrary to habit, doesn't leave the key in the lock, but, still asleep, she locks it from the outside and takes the key with her. Then she roams the 25 rooms on this floor, and perhaps also those on the other floors. This house is full of hiding places, attics, and old junk. It would take a week to explore it thoroughly. Do you understand what I mean?" "Yes, but not entirely," Carmilla replied. "And how do you explain, father, that she woke up in the dressing room, which I had thoroughly searched?" "Carmilla returned after you had already left. She returned to sleep, naturally, and upon waking, she was astonished to find herself there." "I wish all mysteries had as simple an explanation as this one, Carmilla," my father added, satisfied. At that moment, Carmilla was more beautiful than ever. I think it was then that my father compared her appearance to mine, because he suddenly said, "You look very unwell, Laura." Since Carmilla did not want any maid to spend the night in her room, my father ordered one of the servants to sleep outside her door, so that the girl could not leave without being seen by anyone. That night passed quietly, and the following morning, the doctor, whom my father had sent for without my knowing, came to visit me. Madame Perrodon accompanied me to the library, where the doctor awaited me. I explained what had been happening to me recently, and as I proceeded with my story, I noticed his expression grow more thoughtful. We were standing by a window, side by side. When I finished speaking, he leaned against the wall and looked at me with an interest that revealed a certain horror. After meditating for a few moments, he sent for my father. My father arrived smiling, but his smile disappeared when he saw the doctor's worried expression. They immediately launched into a conversation held in low voices, as if afraid that Madame Perrodon or I, who kept our distance, might overhear what they were saying. Suddenly, my father turned his eyes to me. He was pale and looked intensely worried. "Laura, dear, come here." I obeyed, feeling alarmed for the first time, since despite my growing weakness, I didn't believe I was sick. "You told me earlier that you had the sensation of 2 pins being driven into your neck, the night you had that nightmare," the doctor said to me. "Does it still hurt where you felt the pricks?" "No, not at all," I replied. "Can you point to the exact spot with your finger?" "Right below the throat, here," I replied. I was wearing a high-collared dress, which covered the marked area. "Would you please ask your father to unbutton your collar? It's necessary for me to know all the symptoms." I obeyed. The marked spot was about 2 inches below the collar. "My God!" exclaimed my father, turning pale. "Do you see?" inquired the doctor, with a look of triumph. "What's wrong?" I asked, alarmed. "Nothing, young lady, there is only a tiny bluish mark, as small as a pinhead asterisk," the doctor said. And, turning to my father, he added, "We'll see what can be done." "Is it dangerous?" I insisted, distressed. "I don't think so," the doctor replied. "I'm convinced you will improve quickly. I would like to speak with Madame Perrodon," he added, addressing my father. My father called Madame Perrodon. "Miss Laura is not as well as we might wish," the doctor told her. "I don't think it's anything serious. However, we must take certain precautions, for her sake. It is essential that Miss Laura is not left alone for a single moment. For now, that is the only remedy I can prescribe, but I want you to follow my instructions to the letter." "Understood?" My father left to escort the doctor. I saw them cross the drawbridge, deep in an animated discussion. Then I watched the doctor mount his horse, greet my father, and ride off to the east. Almost simultaneously, the mail coach from Dranfeld arrived with a packet of correspondence for my father. Half an hour later, my father joined me. He had a letter in his hand. "It's from General Spieldorf," he said. "He will arrive tomorrow, or perhaps even today." He handed me the open letter, but he didn't seem as pleased as usual when a guest, especially a good friend like the general, came to visit us. He seemed to be hiding something from me. "Dear Papa, will you explain everything?" I said, taking his arm and looking at him pleadingly. "What did the doctor tell you? Did he find me very ill?" "No, darling. He says you will recover quickly." But his tone was sharp. In any case, I would have preferred that our friend the general had chosen another time for his visit. "But, tell me, Papa, what illness do I have?" "None. Don't torment me with your questions," he replied. He had never shown such irritation when speaking to me. Then he realized he had hurt me, and he added, "You will know everything in a couple of days, that is, you will know what I know. Meanwhile, don't ask me any questions." He turned away, ready to leave, but then, before I had time to dwell on how strange everything happening was, he came back to tell me he wanted to go to Karstein and had arranged for the carriage to be ready at noon. Madame Perrodon and I would accompany him. He wanted to visit the priest who lived there, and since Carmilla didn't know him, she could join us later when she got up. She could come with Mademoiselle Lafontaine, who would also bring what was needed for lunch at the castle ruins. At exactly noon, we set off. Past the drawbridge, we turned right and took the road that led to the uninhabited village and the ruins of Karstein Castle. Due to the rough terrain, the road twisted and wound, sometimes alongside a precipice, sometimes up a hillside, offering an inexhaustible variety of landscapes. In one of the countless bends in the road, we unexpectedly came upon our friend the general, riding towards us, followed by his servant, also on horseback. After a cordial exchange of greetings, he took the empty seat in our carriage and sent his horse to the castle with his servant. Only 10 months had passed since we last saw him, but his appearance had changed as if 10 years had gone by. A look of distress had replaced his usual air of calm serenity. It wasn't just the transformation one expects in a person who has suffered great pain. A kind of passionate fury seemed to have contributed to his current state. As soon as we resumed our journey, the general began to tell us about the deception, in his own words, that had led to the death of his young niece. He was suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of fury and bitterness, hurling accusations against the devilish arts of which she had been a victim. My father, understanding that there must be extraordinary reasons for the level-headed general to use such language, asked him to tell us the facts that justified such violent expressions, if it wasn't too painful for him. "With pleasure," the general replied. "But you won't believe it." "And why not?" my father inquired. "Because you, my friend, only believe what corresponds to your prejudices and illusions. I was like you, too. But now I have learned something more." "Test me," my father insisted. "I am less dogmatic than you think. Besides, I know you always base your opinions on reliable evidence, and therefore I am willing to respect your conclusions. You are right. If I have come to believe in the existence of prodigious facts, it has not been lightly. And I can assure you that I have been the victim of a true supernatural conspiracy." I saw that my father, despite his promise, looked at the general with eyes that reflected clear doubts about his old friend's mental capacity. Fortunately, the general didn't notice. He looked with sorrowful eyes at the wild landscape stretching before us. "Are you going to the ruins of Karstein?" he asked. "Curious coincidence. I specifically wanted to ask you to accompany me there. I want to examine them closely. Is it true that there is a ruined chapel with numerous tombs of that extinct family? Yes, and they are very interesting, my father replied. Are you, perhaps, planning to claim ownership? My father asked the question in a joking tone, but the general answered completely seriously. Absolutely not, he exclaimed dryly. I intend to exhume some specimens of that beautiful race. I hope, with God's help, to carry out a pious sacrilege that will rid the earth of some monsters and allow good people who have the right to go to bed in peace to sleep soundly, without the threat of wicked murderers hanging over their heads. My father looked at him again. But this time there was no mistrust in his gaze, instead, he was trying to be penetrating and insightful. The Karstein lineage, he said, died out a long time ago. 100 years, at least. My wife was descended from the Karsteins on her mother's side. But the surname and title disappeared almost a century ago. The castle is in ruins and the village is deserted. No smoke has come out of its chimneys for more than 50 years. That is exactly what I have been told. And other things that will astound you. But it will be better if I tell the story in a logical order. Do you remember my niece? She was the most beautiful girl in the world, and only 3 months ago she was still alive. My father affectionately squeezed the general's hand. Tears filled the old man's eyes, which he did not try to hide. My niece was the comfort of my old age. And now, it's all over. I don't have much life left, but, with God's help, I trust that before I die I will be able to render a great service to mankind. The beginning of the misfortune. It started like this. My niece was eagerly preparing to visit you. In the course of those preparations, we were invited to a party given by my old friend, the Count of Karlofed, whose castle is about 6 leagues from Karstein. The night my misfortune began, a lavish masked ball was held. The castle park was illuminated with colored lanterns, and the fireworks were of a magnificence never before seen. And what music! You know music is my weakness. The best orchestras in the world, and the best European opera singers. I had never attended such a brilliant party, not even in Paris. My dear niece was stunning. She wasn't disguised. The excitement and joy gave her face an indefinable charm. I noticed that another young woman, luxuriously dressed and wearing a mask, was looking at my niece with special interest. I had already seen her at the beginning of the evening, on the castle terrace. She was near us and her attitude showed a very lively interest. She was accompanied by a lady, dressed with the same luxury and also covered with a mask, who had the authoritative air of a person of rank. At that moment we were in a drawing room. My poor niece had danced a lot and was resting, sitting on a chair near the door. I was sitting next to her. The 2 ladies approached us, and the younger one took an empty chair next to my niece, while the older one came to sit next to me. She began talking to herself, as if grumbling. Then, taking advantage of the anonymity the mask afforded her, she addressed me in the tone of an old friend, calling me by name. Her words aroused my curiosity. She referred to the numerous occasions when we had met, at court or in some elegant home. She alluded to incidents I didn't remember, but which, when she cited them, came back to my mind. I felt my curiosity increasing. I ardently wanted to know who was hiding behind that mask, while the lady seemed to be amused by the game. Meanwhile, the young woman, whom the older lady called by the strange name Malarka, had started a conversation with my niece. She introduced herself by saying that her mother was an old friend of mine, praised the dress my girl was wearing, and discreetly complimented her beauty. She entertained her with her sharp observations about the people crowded in the room, and soon they were chatting as if they had known each other all their lives. Then, the unknown young woman took off her mask. She had a beautiful face, with features so pleasant and seductive that it was impossible to escape her charm. My poor niece was instantly captivated. The stranger also seemed to have been fascinated by my niece. For my part, taking advantage of the familiarity allowed by a masquerade ball, I directed some personal questions to my interlocutor. You've put me in a bind, I confessed, laughing. Will you be merciful to me now? Why don't you do me the honor of taking off your mask, as your daughter did? That is an outrageous request, she replied. To ask a lady to give up a privilege. Besides, you might not recognize me. Too many years have passed since you first saw me. Look at my daughter Malarka and you will understand that I can no longer be young. I prefer that you don't have the opportunity to compare me with the image you have of me. Moreover, you are not wearing a mask and cannot offer me anything in return. I appeal to your clemency, I said. And I to yours, she replied. At least, since you have honored me with your conversation, I ask you to tell me your name. Should I call you Madam Countess? She laughed heartily and would undoubtedly have found a way to evade my request, had not a chance event occurred. Although now I am convinced that everything had been meticulously planned. Look, she began to say, but she was interrupted by the presence of a gentleman dressed in black, of strange appearance and a bloodless face like that of a corpse. He was not disguised either. He bowed courteously to my companion and said, "Will the Countess allow me a few words in private?" My interlocutor immediately turned to the newcomer, bringing a finger to her lips to signal silence. Then, addressing me, she apologized. "Please hold my seat for me, General, I will be right back." She walked away in the company of the gentleman dressed in black. I saw them talking animatedly before they disappeared into the crowd. While I was torturing myself trying to identify the lady who seemed to remember me so kindly, she returned accompanied by the same gentleman with the cadaverous face. I heard the latter say to her, "I warn you, Countess, the carriage is waiting at the door." And, after bowing deeply, he disappeared. "So we are losing you, Madam Countess? I hope it will only be for a short time," I ventured. And I bowed to her in turn. "Yes, I have to leave," she replied. "And it is possible that my absence will last a few weeks. I have just received very unpleasant news, and have you remembered who I am yet? I have already told you no. You will know, don't worry. But not now. We are friends, more intimate and older than you suspect. But now I cannot reveal my identity. I will pass by your castle in 3 weeks. Then I will be very happy to resume our old friendship. For the moment, I am very worried about the news they just gave me. I have to travel more than 100 miles as quickly as possible. And if it weren't for the secrecy I am forced to keep about my identity, I would ask you a favor. My poor daughter fell off her horse during a hunt and was dragged by the animal for more than a mile. Her nerves are shattered and our doctor recommended absolute rest. I will have to travel day and night, without interruption. A life is at stake. But I will tell you about it the next time we meet." And then she asked me the favor she had alluded to. It was to host her daughter at my house during her absence. It was a somewhat strange request, not to say audacious. The Countess disconcerted me by anticipating all my possible suspicions, telling me that she understood the impropriety of her action, but that, knowing me as she did, she knew I would take into account the unusual circumstances that forced her to behave in that way. And at that very instant, by a fate that must have been as premeditated as everything that was happening, my niece approached, asking me to invite her new friend Millarca to spend a few days at our house. On any other occasion, I would have put her off by telling her to wait until we could find out the identity of those ladies. But I must confess that the delicate features of the unknown young woman, with her extraordinary power of fascination, had won me over. So I stupidly agreed to take charge of the girl during her mother's absence. The gentleman dressed in black returned for my interlocutor. The last thing the lady asked of me was not to try to find out the young woman's identity until her return. Then she whispered a few words in her daughter's ear, she embraced her coldly and walked away accompanied by the gloomy figure. The next morning, Millarca settled into our house. Deep down, I was satisfied to have found such a pleasant young woman to keep my niece company. But the flip side of the coin soon emerged. At first, Millarca complained of great weakness. She was still recovering from the accident she had suffered, and did not leave her room before noon. Then we casually discovered that, even though she always locked her bedroom door, she was not in at all the hours we thought she was. One day, at dawn, I saw her walking under the trees, heading east. She looked like a person in a trance. I thought she was a sleepwalker. But this hypothesis did not resolve the doubts I had. How did she leave the room if it was locked from the inside? How did she leave the house without opening doors or windows? While I struggled with this contradictory situation, a more serious concern arose. My niece was mysteriously languishing. She started having terrifying nightmares, then said she was visited by a specter that sometimes looked like Millarca and other times had the appearance of an unidentifiable beast circling her bed. Other symptoms soon appeared. A painful sensation below her throat, as if being pricked by 2 pins, the feeling of choking, and a subsequent loss of consciousness. How great my emotion was to hear the symptoms that I myself had experienced described. Especially after having heard the description of the habits and characteristics of our beautiful guest, Carmilla. The ruins of Karstein. We had reached the end of our journey. Before us lay the ruins of a village, nestled among gigantic trees. We descended from the carriage in silence, we were all lost in our thoughts. We climbed a steep hill and found ourselves before Karstein Castle. "Behold your palace," said the general. It was an evil lineage. It is hard to believe that even after death they can continue to infect humanity with their horrible lust. Look, there is the chapel. He pointed to a Gothic-style building hidden among the foliage. I hear a woodcutter's axe very close by, he continued. Perhaps he can provide us with the information we are looking for and point out the tomb of Mircalla, Countess of Karstein. Sometimes these villagers retain the memory of local traditions about the great families. I have a portrait of Mircalla, Countess of Karstein at home, my father said. Would you like to see it? Of course. But we have plenty of time, the general replied. I think I have seen the original, and I hope to convince myself after exploring the chapel. What? Exclaimed my father. Do you claim to have seen Countess Mircalla? But she died over a century ago. She is not as dead as people believe, the general retorted. As we passed under the archway that led to the ruined Gothic chapel, he added. In the few years I have left to live, I only wish for one thing: revenge. And, fortunately, revenge can still be accomplished by a mortal arm. What revenge are you talking about? Asked my father, increasingly astonished. I want to cut off the monster's head, the general replied in a fit of rage, stamping his foot on the ground and raising his hands as if gripping an invisible axe and brandishing it fiercely in the air. What are you saying? Cried my father. I will cut off its head with an axe, with a sickle, with any tool that can serve to slice the neck of a criminal. Look, he shouted, trembling with fury. This wood will serve as a block. I see your daughter is tired, let her rest. I sank onto a block of wood half hidden among the weeds growing between the paving slabs of the chapel floor. Meanwhile, the general called the woodcutter who was trimming the dry branches of the trees very close by. A sturdy old man approached us, carrying an axe in his hand, but it turned out he knew nothing about those ruins. However, he informed us that he knew a forest ranger who lived a few leagues away and who could tell us about every single stone of the chapel. Have you worked in this forest for a long time? My father asked him. Until recently, I was a woodcutter working for the forest ranger. My father, my grandfather, and my whole family, for generations, have held the same trade. I could show you the houses where my ancestors lived. Why was the village abandoned? Because it was haunted by specters. It seems they were pursued to their graves, the corpses were exhumed using the customary methods, and destroyed in the usual way: decapitated, pierced with a stake, and burned. However, many villagers had lost their lives. Despite all the efforts made, despite opening so many tombs and depriving so many vampires of their horrible existence, the village was not completely free from the devilish influence. But a Moravian nobleman, who came to study this part of the country, heard about these events and, being an expert in the matter like many of his compatriots, offered to free the village from that obsession. And this is what he did. One night, during a full moon, he climbed the chapel tower shortly after sunset. He stayed there on guard until he saw the vampire emerge from the grave and shed its white shroud to go towards the village to torment its inhabitants. Once the vampire had left, the foreigner descended from the tower, picked up the shroud, and climbed back up to his lookout. When the vampire returned from its expedition and did not find the shroud where it had left it, it began to howl, enraged by the loss of its funeral attire. The Moravian, then, called out to the vampire and challenged it to climb the tower to retrieve its shroud. The vampire accepted the challenge and began to climb the bell tower. But just as it was about to reach the top, the Moravian struck it on the head with his saber, splitting its skull in two and causing it to fall to the floor of the chapel. He then descended from the tower, decapitated the vampire, and the next day handed the head and body over to the villagers, who pierced it with a stake and burned it, according to the rules established for such cases. The Moravian nobleman was authorized by a Karstein family document to change the location of Countess Mircalla's tomb, which he did, so that no one knows where she is currently buried. Can you tell me where it was before? The general asked. But the woodcutter must have had urgent work because, forgetting to pick up his axe, he left without answering the question. My father and I remained to hear the end of the general's story. The diagnosis and the confrontation. My dear niece was getting worse visibly. The doctor was unsure of the exact nature of her illness. Noticing my worry, he proposed a consultation with one of the best physicians in Graz. He was a man who knew his profession thoroughly and had a lot of experience. After examining my niece, the two doctors shut themselves in the library to confer. From the adjacent room, I could hear their voices, much more heated than one would expect in a purely scientific discussion. I knocked on the door and went in. The old doctor from Graz was defending his theory. His colleague challenged it with evident irony, and every now and then, he couldn't help but laugh outright at his colleague's suggestions. My entrance interrupted the discussion. "General, our doctor told me, it seems that my illustrious colleague thinks we need a sorcerer more than a doctor." Excuse me," replied the old doctor from Graz with evident annoyance. "I will give my opinion, and in my own way, on another occasion. For the moment, I regret to say that my intervention cannot be of any use. Nevertheless, before I leave, I will have the honor of making a suggestion to you." He sat down at a table and began to write. It seemed that the consultation had yielded no results. I was pacing agitatedly in the garden when the old doctor from Graz approached me. He apologized for disturbing me and told me that, in good conscience, he could not leave without offering me an explanation. He said he was sure he was not mistaken, there was no illness with those symptoms, and my niece's death was imminent. She only had 1 day, perhaps 2, left to live. If the fatal process could be stopped, she might regain her strength. But in her current state, 1 more attack would be enough to extinguish the last flicker of life. "And what is the nature of the attack you are referring to?" I asked him. "I explain everything in this note. Call a priest and open and read the letter only in his presence. You may not understand it, but bear in mind that it is a matter of life or death. If you cannot find a priest immediately, you may read it yourself." There was no priest nearby, so I decided to read the letter. At any other time, I would have laughed at its contents. But to what quackery one submits when in a difficult situation, when all known remedies have failed, and the life of a loved one is in danger. The doctor stated in his letter that the sick girl was being visited by a vampire. The pricks she had noticed on her throat had been caused by the sharp, long teeth of one of those horrifying beings. There was no doubt, he added, given the location of the pricks, that it was the typical bite of a vampire, which any expert would confirm. I was quite skeptical regarding the existence of ghosts and vampires in general. At that moment, thinking about the old doctor's theory, I told myself that great learning and clear intelligence can be allied with madness. But I was so desperate that I decided to follow the instructions contained in the letter. I hid in the dressing room that connected to the poor patient's room, which was lit all night by a candle, and waited for my niece to fall asleep. Through the grate above the dressing room door, I kept watch over the saber I had placed on a table, as prescribed by the doctor. After a while, I saw a dark shape crawling at the foot of the bed that suddenly lunged at my niece's neck, transforming into a large, pulsating mass. I was petrified for a few seconds. Then I opened the dressing room door, grasped the saber, and approached the bed. The monster dropped to the floor and remained motionless beside the bed. It stared at me intently, with an expression of ferocity in its pupils. Despite its horrible appearance, I recognized Millarca. I brought the saber down with all my strength, but the monster was already by the door, unharmed. I ran after it, but it vanished as if by magic. My saber broke against the door. I cannot describe what happened that horrible night. All the inhabitants of the house woke up and started moving. Millarca's specter had disappeared, but her victim rapidly deteriorated and passed away in the early hours of the morning. The elderly general was distraught. My father and I remained silent. After a while, my father walked around the chapel, carefully reading the inscriptions on the gravestones. The general, meanwhile, leaned against the wall and wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. The familiar voices of Carmilla and Mademoiselle Lafontaine, approaching at that moment, revived me. Suddenly, beneath an arch topped by one of those grotesque monsters that sprang from the imagination of ancient Gothic sculptors, I saw the seductive figure of Carmilla appear. I stood up to answer her particularly attractive smile, when the old general let out a cry and rushed between us, brandishing the axe the woodcutter had forgotten. Carmilla's face had undergone a brutal transformation. She backed away. But before I could scream, the general brought the axe down on her with all his might. Carmilla seemed to lean forward as a result of the blow, but what she actually did was grab the general's wrist with her delicate hand. The old man struggled vigorously, fighting to break free, but was forced to open his hand and drop the axe. Carmilla vanished as if the air had swallowed her. The general staggered and leaned against the wall. His hair was standing on end, and his face was soaked in sweat. He was pale as death. Everything I have just told happened in a matter of seconds. I don't know if I lost consciousness. The first thing I remember after Carmilla's disappearance is Madame Perrodon's voice, asking me, "Where is Miss Carmilla?" I was finally able to reply that I did not know. "She just left through here," I said, pointing to the door through which Madame Perrodon had entered. I was there, and I did not see her. She immediately began calling her name, without getting a response. Is she called Carmilla? Inquired the general, who had not fully recovered. Yes, indeed, I replied. Carmilla, Millarca, the general murmured. There can be no doubt, it is the same one who was once called Myrkaya of Karstein. Dear Laura, leave this cursed land immediately. I believe you will never see Carmilla again. As the general spoke these words, one of the strangest men I have ever seen entered the chapel. He was tall, thin, very hunched, and dressed in black. His complexion was dark and lined with deep wrinkles. He wore an old-fashioned hat adorned with an enormous feather. His long, greasy hair fell down his back. He walked slowly, shuffling his feet. He wore gold-rimmed glasses, and his gaze was fixed alternately on the chapel ceiling and the pavement. His long, thin arms swung continuously, like the pendulum of a clock. This is my man, the general shouted upon seeing him, rushing to meet him with clear joy. My dear Baron, how glad I am to see you. I didn't expect to find you so soon. He gestured to my father, who had returned from his exploration in the meantime, and introduced that strange character to him, simply calling him Baron. Immediately, the three men plunged into an animated conversation. The stranger took a tattered plan from his pocket and spread it out on the pink granite of a tomb. With a pencil, he began to trace lines from one end of the plan to the other, visually consulting certain places in the chapel, which led me to believe it was a floor plan of the building we were in. He also frequently consulted a dirty, yellowed notebook, whose pages were filled with tiny, dense writing. The three men eventually walked to the side opposite where I was and then began to measure the distance between the tombs in paces. Finally, they stopped at the wall and examined it carefully, lifting the ivy that covered it in that spot. They soon discovered a marble slab, on which some letters were carved. Helped by the woodcutter, who had returned for his axe, they dragged the enormous slab to a well-lit place. It was, in fact, the sepulchre of Millarca, Countess of Karstein. The general raised his hands to the sky in silent thanksgiving. Tomorrow, I heard him say, the commissioner will come. We will act according to legal precepts. Then, facing the old man with the gold-rimmed glasses, he warmly shook his hands. How can I thank you for your help, Baron? How can we express our gratitude? You have delivered this region from a horrible plague. Thanks to you, we have been able to locate the most hateful of monsters. My father approached me and hugged and kissed me repeatedly. It is time for us to go home, he said. His words sounded like heavenly music to my ears, for I had never felt as tired as I did at that moment. The final execution. Once at the castle, my satisfaction turned to fright upon discovering that there was no news of Carmilla. I was given no explanation about what had happened at the castle ruins, and it was evident that my father preferred, for the time being, to keep the secret. Carmilla's absence, which under those circumstances was most sinister, kept me on edge. And my anxiety increased with the preparations made for that night. 2 maid-servants, in addition to Madame Sheridan, stayed in my room, while my father and one of the servants mounted guard outside the door. The next day, the planned actions took place in the Karstein chapel, with due formalities. The tomb of the Countess of Karstein was opened. The general and my father recognized in it the beautiful and treacherous guest. Despite having been buried for over 150 years, her features were full of life. Her eyes were completely open. The corpse did not appear to have undergone the process of decomposition. The 2 doctors attending the ceremony attested to the prodigious fact that the corpse was breathing, albeit very faintly, and that it was possible to detect the faint beating of her heart. The limbs retained their flexibility, and the flesh was elastic. The lead coffin was full of blood, which soaked the corpse. It was an irrefutable case of vampirism. In accordance with ancient practices, they lifted the corpse and drove a stake through its chest. Then they cut off her head, and a jet of blood spurted from the severed neck. Next, they placed the body and head on a pile of firewood and set fire to it until nothing remained but a pile of ashes. The ashes were scattered to the 4 winds, and from then on, the region was free of vampires. My father keeps a copy of the Imperial Commission's report, with the signature of everyone who witnessed that horrible ceremony. I have copied the description of the gruesome scene from this official document. Personal reflections on the horror. I have not recounted these events calmly. Oh, no, I cannot think of those events without feeling deeply disturbed. If I had not been asked so many times, I would never have decided to write the story of events that shattered, perhaps forever, my nerves, casting the shadow of that unspeakable horror which, despite the years that have passed, continues to haunt me day and night, making solitude unbearable. I will add a few words about the strange Baron von der Berg, thanks to whose erudition the discovery of Countess Mircalla's tomb was possible. He lived in Graz on a small income, all that remained of his family's fortune, and devoted himself to the study of vampirism in all its forms. He had read everything written on the subject, Magia Posthuma, Phlegon de Mirabilibus, Augustinus de Cura pro Mortui, Philosophicae et Christianae Cogitationes de Vampiris by John Christopher Herrenberg, and many other books, of which I only recall some that he lent to my father. He had a voluminous archive of all judicial cases initiated for vampirism, and from them, he had deduced some fundamental principles about vampires. For example, the mortal paleness attributed to that class of specters is pure literary fiction. In reality, both in the grave and when they appear publicly, they look healthy. When their coffin is opened, the same signs appear that demonstrated that the Countess of Karstein, deceased a century and a half earlier, was a vampire. What was, and remains, most inexplicable is how they can leave their tomb and return to it. The double life of vampires is sustained by daily sleep in the tomb. Their monstrous craving for the blood of living beings provides them with the necessary energy to survive during their waking hours. The vampire is prone to falling victim to vehement passions, similar to love, for certain people. To obtain their blood, they employ infinite patience and resort to all kinds of stratagems to overcome the obstacles separating them from the desired object. They do not desist from their endeavor until their passion has been satisfied and they have been able to drain the life from the coveted victim. They even go so far as to marry her, prolonging their criminal pleasure with the refinement of an epicure. But more frequently, they head directly for their goal, conquer by force, and devour their victim in a single feast. It seems that the vampire, sometimes, must adhere to certain conditions. In the example I have just recounted, Mircalla had to limit herself to using a name that, if not exactly her own, had to contain all the letters that composed it. Mircalla, Carmilla, Millarca. My father explained to Baron Vordenberg, who was our guest for a couple of weeks, the story of the Moravian knight and the vampire of the Karstein chapel, and asked the Baron how he had been able to discover the exact location of Countess Mircalla's long-forgotten tomb. The Baron smiled enigmatically. He looked at the case of his glasses, which he held in his hand, waited for a few moments, and then, raising his gaze again, said, "I possess many writings and documents of that notable personage. The most curious is a kind of narrative about his visit to Karstein, which you just mentioned. Naturally, the legend always distorts the facts. It is possible that they mistook him for a Moravian nobleman, as he had changed his name. In reality, he was a nobleman born in Upper Styria. In his youth, he had been the passionate and favorite lover of the beautiful Mircalla, Countess of Karstein. The premature death of his beloved plunged him into inconsolable grief. I believe it is necessary to clarify that vampires can multiply and grow, according to a law that governs these monsters. Suppose a place completely free of this threat. How does it appear and develop? Imagine that an individual, sufficiently wicked, kills himself. Under certain circumstances, suicides can transform into vampires. This vampire begins to visit living beings while they sleep. The latter die and, once buried, are almost invariably transformed into vampires. That is what happened to the beautiful Mircalla, who was visited by one of those monsters. My ancestor Vordenberg, whose title I bear, discovered this history and, in the course of the studies to which he dedicated himself, delved deeply into this matter. Among other things, he concluded that the Countess, who was his idol in life, was suspected of vampirism. He was horrified by the idea that her remains might be profaned in a posthumous execution. He left a curious document demonstrating that the vampire, once deprived of its double existence, is condemned to an even more terrible one. And he decided, consequently, to preserve his beloved Mircalla from that possibility. Feigning a study trip, he moved to Karstein and managed to make the trace and memory of Mircalla's tomb disappear. But, after a few years and nearing the end of his days, thinking about the world he was soon to leave, he considered what he had done from another perspective and was terrified. He drew the designs and notes that have served as my guide and confessed in writing what he had carried out. Perhaps he intended to do something more definitive, but death prevented him. Only by availing himself of the hand of one of his descendants has he been able to direct, too late for many, the search for the monster. Later, in the course of a conversation, he added, "One of the proofs of vampirism is the strength of the hands. Mircalla's frail hand gripped the general's hand like a steel noose when he raised the axe to kill her. The strength of a vampire's hand leaves an indelible mark on its prey, causing an atrophy that only heals very slowly, and not in all cases. The following spring I spent in Italy with my father. We traveled for a year. It took me a long time for the horror of those events to dissolve from my memory. Even now, many years later, the image of Carmilla frequently appears to me in her diverse and changing aspects. Sometimes as the beautiful and languid young woman, other times, as the monster I saw in the castle ruins. And often, in the middle of a nightmare, I tremble with fear because I seem to hear the light footsteps of Carmilla approaching my bedroom door.